If you still believe you know how Jesus prayed, it's because you've never read between the lines. And I say this not as someone repeating what I've heard, but as someone who has spent years comparing manuscripts, observing invisible erasures, words exchanged with surgical delicacy, meanings intentionally displaced. What I'm going to show you isn't in sermons, it isn't in pulpits, it isn't in the ready-made versions you received. It's in the cracks. It's in what has been softened, in what has been omitted, in what no one asked you to observe. And when you see it, you can no longer unsee it. From childhood, you were taught that Jesus spoke with the Creator God, the same Yahweh of the ancient narratives. A God of the throne, of distance, of commandments. But when I began to read the older texts, not as a devotee, but as someone who suspects the obvious, I realized something didn't add up. Jesus doesn't speak as one who asks for an audience. He doesn't plead. He doesn't negotiate. He moves as one who occupies a point of origin. And this difference is not poetic, it's structural. Ask yourself honestly now, why do so many people pray their whole lives and still feel the same emptiness inside? Why does prayer, for most, seem more like a distressed plea than a living connection? Have you ever noticed how it almost always stems from neediness, from fear, from the feeling that something essential is out of reach? I have. And when I started cross-referencing manuscripts, confronting translations, rereading Greek terms that have been corrected over the centuries, it became clear that Jesus' language doesn't fit into that logic. He didn't speak to the Creator God as a servant speaks to a king. He addressed the Father as one who acknowledges his own origin. In some passages, the word used doesn't directly correspond to the figure of Yahweh. It points to something prior, deeper, a source that doesn't demand, doesn't punish, doesn't negotiate. A consciousness that doesn't place itself outside, but inside. And here begins the real discomfort. If Jesus spoke to this source, why were you taught to speak to a distant throne? I know, this question creates tension, because it touches the heart of what you've learned to call faith. But faith isn't the absence of questioning. Faith, when it's alive, is born from lucidity. And lucidity demands that you distrust the obvious, that you compare versions, that you realize that small changes in words can reshape centuries of human behavior. Let's consider a common scene. You kneel, close your eyes, and begin to pray. You ask for help, you ask for protection, you ask for a way out, you ask for meaning. In the end, you might feel temporary relief, but also a strange feeling of remaining distant, as if the connection is never complete. Now compare this to Jesus' posture. He gives thanks before the event. He declares before the manifestation. He doesn't act like someone trying to convince an external force, but like someone aligned with a reality he already recognizes from within. It's not mysticism. It's a stance. I spent years searching for where this was altered. Not in grand conspiracies, but in subtle translation decisions. In terms that indicated unity being converted into terms that suggest submission. In words that spoke of origin being reinterpreted as hierarchy. You don't erase a teaching, you dilute it. You don't deny an idea, you change the starting point. And here you need to take an internal pause. Because perhaps, for the first time, the possibility is emerging that the way you learn to pray doesn't bring you closer, but keeps you on the sidelines. That what you call humility may be, in part, an emotional training in dependence. That what you call devotion may be mixed with a deep habit of putting yourself down. If this resonates with you, I ask something of you now. Before continuing, comment on where you're watching from, even anonymously. City, state, or country. I want to see how far this reading between the lines is reaching, because each comment is proof that someone, somewhere, has begun to question the obvious. Let's go back to the text. When Jesus says, "I and the Father are one," this is not a religious metaphor. It's an ontological statement. He doesn't say, "I serve the Father," nor "I ask the Father." He says, "We are one." This phrase, read without filters, dissolves all the architecture of distance that was built afterward. But that's precisely why it was surrounded by explanations, doctrines, and interpretations that made it too safe to bring about real transformation. Have you ever wondered why this unity has never been encouraged as a practice? Why almost no one is taught to inhabit this position, but only to venerate it from a distance? I asked myself this question for a long time, until I realized that the problem is not theological, it is political. A person who feels united with the source does not depend on mediation. And everything that does not depend on mediation threatens structures. Therefore, I affirm there is something profoundly strange in Jesus' prayers when compared to what you practice today. Not strange in a mystical sense, but in a strategic sense. He doesn't plead, he aligns. He doesn't diminish himself, he positions himself. He doesn't speak from lack, but from origin. And this changes everything about spirituality, about identity, and about what it truly means to connect. If the way you learn to pray stemmed from a distorted interpretation, then perhaps the distance you feel isn't your fault, but a legacy of that method. And if that's true, the question that remains isn't comfortable, but necessary. What if the way you learn to speak with the divine is keeping you precisely from what you seek most? When you close this video and return to your ordinary life, nothing seems mystical. The sink is full, your cell phone vibrates with bills, someone is waiting for an answer you don't know how to give. It is precisely there that the mystery begins to reveal itself, not in ancient deserts, but in the weary repetition of your days. I have observed this for years, comparing personal stories with fragments of forgotten texts, and I always notice the same pattern. Prayer emerges as a last resort, not as a central point. You only speak to the divine when everything has already spiraled out of control, when anxiety has taken over your body, when the feeling of emptiness has become almost physical. Imagine a typical morning. You wake up late, rush, forget something important, lose money, lose patience, lose focus. At the end of the day, exhausted, you finally sit in silence and ask for everything to be all right. Notice the gesture. You don't enter the prayer from a place of wholeness, but from exhaustion. You don't speak as someone who occupies a center, you speak as someone trying to mend what has crumbled. And even if no one has explicitly told you this, your body has already learned the language of supplication. Drooping shoulders, short breaths, a voice that comes out weak even when no one is listening. It's an old emotional script. Now compare this with the scenes attributed to Jesus before the decisive moments. There is no theatrical urgency, no haste, none of that silent despair you know so well. He withdraws, retreats, and returns with an almost disconcerting clarity. This has always intrigued me, because it doesn't resemble faith, it resembles positioning. And positioning doesn't arise from asking, it arises from the perception of place. Perhaps you remember a rare moment when something within you effortlessly organized itself. It wasn't during a long prayer, but perhaps while walking in silence, listening to music, making a difficult decision and, strangely, feeling no fear. These moments pass quickly, but leave a mark. It's as if, for seconds, you stopped seeing yourself as someone separate. These moments didn't become doctrine, didn't become ritual, but they are the closest thing to what ancient texts describe as alignment. The mystery begins to take shape when you realize that these experiences are neither encouraged nor taught. On the contrary, they are almost treated as dangerous, as if accessing a state of wholeness were something that needed to be moderated. You are encouraged to ask for more, but rarely to take a stand. And then prayer becomes a habit that doesn't transform, only provides temporary relief. I've heard stories of people who have spent decades praying and yet always felt they fell short. One woman once told me she prayed every day, but always with the feeling that something essential wasn't happening. A man confessed that he left church feeling more guilty than when he entered. These stories repeat themselves like an echo, and none of them are about a lack of faith. They're about position. They're about speaking to the source from the shore. And race a turning point that almost no one notices. You start to confuse humility with self-effacement. You believe that diminishing yourself is a virtue, that putting yourself down is respect. But this attitude, when repeated for years, creates a specific type of mind, a mind that asks permission even to exist. This mind becomes predictable, domesticated, comfortable for any structure that needs people who don't occupy their own center. When I read the older fragments, I see a different logic. I see someone who doesn't speak to the Father as one who asks for help, but as one who returns. The difference is subtle in language, but brutal in effect. A request reinforces the distance. An alignment dissolves the separation. A request is born from lack. An alignment is born from recognition. Perhaps now you are beginning to understand why so many people feel empty even after praying. Not because God is distant, but because the way we speak to Him has been shaped to maintain that distance. And this doesn't require conspiracy, it only requires habit. A habit that is taught, reinforced, celebrated as a virtue. There's something almost cruel about it. You believe you're getting closer, but the method keeps you going around in circles. Like someone walking in circles, believing they're making progress. Prayer becomes a movement that goes nowhere, a beautiful dance that never crosses the room. I observe this pattern in small things as well. In the way you apologize even before you know if you were wrong. In the way you over-explain yourself, as if you needed to justify your own presence. All of this is misplaced prayer. It's the same logic applied to your entire life. You speak to the world as you speak to the divine, from the margins. And then comes the question that almost always marks the beginning of change: what if the problem isn't with your faith, but with the position from which it is exercised? What if you've learned to speak to the source as someone looking upwards, when perhaps the invitation has always been to look inwards? This idea is frightening because it doesn't come with a manual. It doesn't offer immediate comfort. On the contrary, it returns responsibility. Because if you're no longer asking, you're taking responsibility. If you're not begging, you're positioning yourself. And that changes how you navigate every everyday problem, from a simple decision to a profound loss. Perhaps, from now on, you will begin to notice how much your prayer resembles a plea for rescue and how much this shapes your identity. Perhaps you will begin to realize that the weariness comes not only from a difficult life, but from the inner place from which you try to fix it. And this realization, in itself, is already a rupture. In the next part, I'll show you how small word choices in ancient texts were enough to alter this axis over centuries. Not as theory, but as silent engineering of the mind. Because when you understand how language was used to move you from the origin to the margin, you begin to suspect everything that seems too obvious. I continue reading the old texts like someone disassembling a machine from the inside, piece by piece, not to destroy it, but to understand how it was built. And the more I compare versions, the more I realize that the biggest change didn't happen in the stories, but in the verbs. Where there was once language of identity, there came to be language of submission. Where there was presence, distance entered. This didn't happen all at once, but like a constant trickle, generation after generation, until no one noticed anymore how much the internal posture had been altered. In some very old Greek manuscripts, there are constructions that don't fit into the later religious mold. These are phrases that don't ask, but affirm. They don't implore, but acknowledge. They don't negotiate, but take a stand. When these constructions were retranslated into later languages, they took on tones of supplication, as if the mind of the translator was no longer capable of sustaining the idea of someone speaking from the origin. This makes me think that it's not just about theology, but about collective psychology. Language reflects the mental state of an era. When you read a text with this perspective, you realize that it wasn't just transmitted, but domesticated. A dangerous message isn't erased, it's softened enough so that it continues to exist without causing real change. And thus is born a spirituality that seems profound, but doesn't move anyone's axis. Have you ever wondered how many ideas have been transformed not by censorship, but by excessive sensitivity? How many truths have lost their force not through opposition, but through overly careful translation? There is something even more intriguing. The words that indicated union in the oldest texts often appear associated with actions, not feelings. It's not feeling close, it's being. It's not seeking, it's dwelling. Spirituality, at this initial stage, doesn't seem emotional, but structural. It doesn't ask you to feel something, it asks you to change your inner position. This is a huge difference, because feelings come and go, but position remains. When this was replaced by emotional language, the practice changed. You started looking for experiences, not states. You started expecting chills, comfort, signals. And when they don't come, you believe you failed. You don't realize you're using a different key for the original lock. Can you see how almost everything today revolves around feeling something during prayer, rather than internal repositioning? Haven't you been trained to confuse emotion with alignment? There is also a subtle shift in verb tense. In older texts, the fulfillment appears as something already recognized, while in later versions it moves into the future. It will be granted, it will be given, it will come. This constant future keeps the mind in a state of perpetual waiting. The promise is never fulfilled in the present, only renewed tomorrow. This is how practice ceases to transform and begins to postpone. I call this the spirituality of postponement. You don't occupy the present moment, you project yourself into a later one. And in the meantime, you continue living from the same internal position. The mind gets used to waiting, and waiting becomes identity. At what point did you realize that you spend more time waiting for something to change than actually embracing a different inner self? Could it be that your faith has been trained to keep you always one step away from what you seek? When I cross-reference these details with accounts from ordinary people, everything takes on an almost physical weight. People who have been praying for years and always feel in preparation. Always about to experience something greater, but never now. People who believe they need to improve more, purify more, deserve more. This is not humility, it's existential procrastination. What's most unsettling is that this logic doesn't only appear in religion. It permeates all of life. You wait for the right moment to be who you are. You wait to be ready to speak, ready to act, ready to decide. The pattern is the same, the source is always a little further ahead. And then you read old phrases that say something very different, but you no longer know how to listen to them. Because your mind has been trained to listen from a distance. Even when you read about unity, you translate it as a future promise, not as a current situation. Have you ever noticed how, when reading certain words, something inside you shuts down even before you understand? Could there be an invisible filter between the text and your perception? There is also a question of rhythm. In the oldest texts, silence is not absence, it is a space for internal action. In later practices, silence becomes merely an interval between words. You speak, pause, speak again, but you never inhabit silence as a place. And it is in silence that identity is reorganized, not in sentences. When silence ceases to be the central focus and becomes merely rest, prayer transforms into discourse. You talk a lot, but listen little. And without listening, there is no realignment, only repetition. How many times have you left a prayer with more words than you went in with? How many times has the silence been just an uncomfortable void that you filled too quickly? These changes seem small, but they form an entire architecture. An architecture that keeps the mind revolving around the source without ever crossing it. And the more I study this, the clearer it becomes that there wasn't a single moment of rupture, but a series of micro-decisions that, added together, changed the axis of a civilization. You weren't separated from your origins by decree, but by habit. By words that, little by little, taught you to see yourself as someone always on the move, never at home. Perhaps now you're starting to feel a slight inner instability, as if the familiar ground is shifting. This is natural. It's the effect of realizing that the problem wasn't in your dedication, but in the map you received. And when the map changes, the entire territory reorganizes itself. If you had learned from the beginning to pray not as someone who asks, but as someone who gives, how many different choices in your life would you have made? How many times would you have stopped waiting and started taking action? This part of the journey doesn't bring a conclusion, but a fissure. An opening through which something begins to enter. Because from the moment you realize that words have shaped your inner position, you can no longer use them in the same way. And perhaps that's exactly what has always been most feared, not that you lose faith, but that you change the place from which you speak to what you call divine. There was a moment, during a quiet research trip I took in a nearly forgotten library in the European countryside, when I came across a footnote that no one quotes. It wasn't a treatise, nor an apocryphal gospel, but a side note from an 18th century translator, almost apologetic for something he had done. He mentioned that a certain Greek verb, used in a passage about Jesus speaking to the Father, had been adjusted for greater doctrinal clarity. The phrase chilled me. Clarity for whom? Adjusted for what need? That small observation, lost among yellowed pages, revealed more about the history of prayer than many entire volumes. When I started cross-referencing this kind of detail with other sources, I noticed a pattern that doesn't appear in official speeches. Translations are never neutral. They carry the mindset of the translator. And if, over the centuries, translators have come to see spirituality as submission, not as a position, each word has been shaped in that sense, almost like water slowly eroding rock. There is no explicit conspiracy, there is culture in action. There are curious accounts of very ancient Christian communities, especially in the Syrian and Egyptian deserts, that practiced something called return to the heart. They did not describe prayer as petition, but as a movement of internal repositioning. Some writings claim that when this state was reached, the person lost the fear of death, loss, and rejection. This displeased the local leaders, because a people without fear is not easily governed. Over time, these communities disappeared, not because of violent persecution, but because of organized oblivion. Their texts did not enter the canon, and their practices were classified as too strange. In another study, I found an almost absurd piece of information in certain very old Latin versions. The expression equivalent to "the kingdom is within you" appears in marginal notes as "interpret with caution." This is not a translation error, but an ideological warning. That phrase, if read literally, shifts the entire logic of spiritual power. The kingdom ceases to be a place to be reached and becomes a state to be recognized. This is too revolutionary for any structure based on mediation. These details, when placed side by side, begin to form a disturbing mosaic. Jesus does not seem to teach a religion, but an access. He does not seem to found a hierarchy, but to dissolve it. And whenever this reading threatened to emerge, something happened. A text was labeled as dangerous, a term was softened, a practice was abandoned for lack of clarity. There are also improbable events that defy linear narrative. At the beginning of the 20th century, a German researcher reported seeing a fragment of papyrus in a private collection that described the prayer as placing oneself at the origin from where everything proceeds. A few years later, upon attempting to return to the site, the fragment had disappeared. There is no record of theft or fire, just absence. This type of void repeats itself in history as if certain ideas simply slip out of collective memory. When I look at your daily life, I see how this erasure manifests itself in a practical way. You were taught to pray in times of crisis, not in moments of wholeness. Prayer became a patch, not an axis. You ask when something hurts, not when something is getting organized. This shapes the mind to associate the sacred with collapse, not with stability. And so, even when everything is fine, you feel strange in silence, as if you are only allowed to speak to the divine from a place of need. The oldest accounts, however, speak of something opposite. They describe prayer as a continuous state, not as a one-off intervention. It is not a gesture to solve problems, but a way of being. And when this is lost, the practice becomes a tool for emotional survival, not a path to self-discovery. It's curious to note how, in very different cultures, whenever someone starts talking about returning to the origin, about inner unity, about positioning oneself instead of pleading, there's an immediate attempt to frame, classify, and normalize it, as if there were an invisible limit to how much spiritual autonomy can be tolerated. When that limit is crossed, history simply ceases to record what happened. Perhaps you've already experienced something similar on a smaller scale. An insight you had, but which didn't find room to grow. A perception that seemed too big to fit into the discourse you knew. And so you set it aside, not because you disagreed, but because you didn't know where to place it. This is the same mechanism on a personal level as what occurred on a historical level. That which doesn't fit is discarded. Now, all of this converges on an inevitable point. If Jesus' prayer was not a plea, but a return, if the oldest texts speak of a position and not a request, if entire communities disappeared for practicing this logic, then the spirituality that has reached you is merely a domesticated version of something far more radical. And perhaps the discomfort you feel upon hearing this is not resistance, but memory. A memory of something that was never fully taught to you, but that has always been latent. As if a part of you recognizes, even without being able to explain it, that the source was never distant, only poorly indicated. And this silent recognition begins to reorganize the way you listen, the way you read, the way you speak. From here, the journey takes on a new tone. It's no longer just about understanding what was lost, but about facing what that demands of you now. Because once you realize that perhaps you've learned to speak to the divine from the shore, you can no longer pretend it doesn't matter. The question has already been planted, and it will not be silenced. What would you do if you discovered that prayer was never a request, but a return to the place from which you have always been speaking without knowing it? There comes a point when the whole story ceases to be external and begins to press from within. It's no longer about manuscripts, libraries, or ancient translators. It's about you, now, realizing that perhaps you've spent your entire life speaking to the divine from a place that was never truly yours. And this realization is not gentle. It causes tension because it dismantles deep emotional habits. Think about the moment when something very serious happens: a diagnosis, a loss, a financial setback, a betrayal. The body reacts before the mind. The chest tightens, breathing shortens, the feeling of the ground disappearing appears. In seconds you are already asking. You don't choose to ask, you enter into it as a reflex. This reflex has been trained over years, perhaps generations. And while you ask, something silent happens. You see yourself as smaller than the situation. You place yourself below your own fear. Now imagine the opposite scene, almost impossible for someone who has never been taught this. The same difficult situation arises, but instead of running away, you retreat inward. Not to hide, but to align yourself. You don't formulate words, you don't explain, you don't plead. You simply return to a state of presence that doesn't depend on the outcome. This movement is so different from the norm that it generates almost panic at first, because the mind has been conditioned to act, not to occupy. This is where the narrative takes its first major turn. Perhaps the prayer you practice today is actually a mechanism for emotional release, not a path to transformation. It relieves tension, but doesn't change your position. It functions as a release valve, not as an axis. And that's why you return to the same place as always after it's over. I saw this repeated in very different people. A businessman who told me he prayed every day, but always with the feeling of being almost there. A mother who said she felt peace for a few minutes, but then the same fear returned. A young man who believed he was getting closer to God, but lived in constant anxiety about not doing enough. They all shared the same invisible logic. They were talking to the source on the shore. What's most disturbing is realizing that this pattern doesn't arise from nothing. It's reinforced in every cultural gesture. You learn to be grateful when something goes right, but not to take a stand beforehand. You learn to ask when it hurts, but not to dwell when everything is silent. You learn to speak, but not to be present. And this creates a spirituality that is noisy on the outside and empty on the inside. Then the twist happens. You begin to notice that, in the earliest accounts of Jesus, he never seems surprised by what is about to happen. Not because he controls everything, but because he doesn't react out of neediness. He withdraws, retreats, and returns with a kind of firmness that doesn't ask permission. This firmness cannot be taught in words, because it doesn't arise from the phrase, but from the stance. And this is where the tension intensifies, because the inevitable question arises: if this way of praying is possible, why weren't you taught it? Why does almost everything you've learned prepare you to speak to the source only when you are broken? Why was wholeness never presented as a starting point, but as a future promise? Perhaps because a person who positions themselves from a place of wholeness is not easily led. They are not satisfied with empty explanations, they are not moved by guilt, they do not bend out of fear. They become difficult to fit into systems that depend on emotional predictability. And this generates discomfort, not only in institutions, but also in the closest relationships. A mind that doesn't constantly ask begins to change the way it relates to everything. This is where many back down. Because realizing this means losing an old emotional crutch. Asking is comfortable, aligning is demanding. Asking transfers responsibility, aligning returns it entirely. And the return of responsibility doesn't come with applause, it comes with silence. You may have felt something similar when you tried to stop over-explaining, justifying yourself, diminishing yourself. At first, it seems like arrogance, like coldness. But, little by little, you realize that it's not about closing yourself off, but about not becoming fragmented. The same thing happens here. When you stop praying from a place of lack, you don't become insensitive, you become whole. The narrative now moves faster because there's no going back. You've already seen that there's another way to move forward. And this creates internal pressure to experiment, even without knowing how. You begin to distrust your own words, to notice how much they carry hidden hierarchies. Please, if it's your will, if I deserve it. Seemingly humble phrases, but ones that reinforce the distance. And each time you repeat them, you reinforce the identity of someone who speaks from the bottom up. The practice seems spiritual, but the effect is psychological. It shapes who you are when no one is watching. Now the story approaches its most critical point. Because it's no longer about understanding, but about choosing. To continue using prayer as a cry for help, or to begin treating it as a return to the center. To continue seeing oneself as separate, or to begin experiencing the language of unity. To continue speaking outwards, or to learn to dwell before speaking. This is the moment when most narratives would end with a promise, but here there is no promise. There is only an open, almost unbearable tension, because the conclusion is not in an ancient text, but in your next reaction to life. In the next problem, the next loss, the next joy. Will you ask for something, or will you take a stand? Because from now on, you can no longer say that you didn't know there was another way. You've arrived here because something within you no longer accepts simply asking. Throughout this journey, I haven't led you to manuscripts out of historical curiosity, nor to ancient concepts out of intellectual fascination. I've brought you to this point because there comes a moment in life when a person stops talking about transformation and begins to confront their own place in the world. And that moment is now. From today onward, prayer ceases to be an automatic gesture and becomes a conscious act of return. Not a return to a belief, but to oneself. The next time you feel that immediate impulse to ask when fear grips you, when uncertainty dominates, when everything seems to slip away, don't formulate any sentence. Interrupt the reflex. Observe what happens inside you before the words. You will perceive a mixture of urgency, a feeling of lack, almost an internal cry for help. This is the old pattern trying to stay alive. Breathe. Not to calm down, but to occupy space. Bring your attention to your body, to the present moment, to the simple fact of being here. Don't imagine anything, don't visualize, don't beg. Just remain for a few seconds in this inner place where you are not explaining yourself to anyone. This, in itself, is already a break with everything you've been taught. When words arise, transform their nature. Don't speak as if asking for something you don't have, but as if returning to what is. Replace "help me" with "I realign myself." Replace "save me" with "I return to my center." The difference isn't in the pretty phrase, it's in the point from which it originates. Asking keeps you outside. Declaring brings you inside. Then, be silent again. Don't expect a response, don't look for a sign, don't try to feel anything special. Just remain for a few moments, holding this new inner position. You're not trying to change the world. You're changing the place from which you move within it. This won't produce fireworks. What it will produce is something rarer: responsibility. Because, from that moment on, you begin to realize that many things in your life weren't tied to fate, but to how you positioned yourself in relation to it. You begin to notice that you no longer need to diminish yourself to be heard, nor explain yourself in order to exist. Every everyday situation becomes an invitation. A conflict, a frustration, a loss, a difficult decision. In all of them, the same silent question will arise: will you react from neediness, or will you return to your center? At first, you'll still find yourself asking. That's not a flaw, it's memory. The important thing is to notice and return. Return to your body, return to presence, return to your position. Over time, something changes. You talk less and feel more. You justify yourself less and take a stand more. You expect less and act with more clarity. And then, almost without realizing it, you understand what previously seemed like just an old saying: the kingdom was never distant. It was always a way of being. Now I want to hear from you. Leave a comment even anonymously about what most resonated with you today. Like this video if something here truly touched you, and subscribe to the channel to continue this journey. Because, from now on, you can no longer pretend you didn't see it.